Some stories unfold in the most ordinary places on the most unremarkable days, yet they reveal the deepest truths about human nature. That was exactly what happened one late afternoon at Westwood Community Bank on Harper Street in San Francisco. The bank was packed. Long lines stretched from the service counters to the entrance. Customers shifted impatiently, checking their watches and murmuring complaints under their breath. The air was thick with tension as employees rushed back and forth, struggling to keep up with the chaos. Behind the counter, Madison Brooks, a young teller with weary eyes and an impatient demeanor, typed away at her computer. She had worked at the bank long enough to know which customers were worth her time and which ones weren't. And she had already decided that the elderly woman standing in front of her wasn't important. Evelyn Harris, a 73-year-old retired librarian, stood quietly, clutching an envelope in her slightly trembling hands. She had always been independent, never one to ask for favors, but today she needed answers. Recently, she had noticed unexpected fees deducted from her account. Small amounts, but enough to impact her already tight monthly budget. Living on a fixed pension, every dollar mattered. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "I believe there's been a mistake with my account. I've been charged fees I wasn't informed about." Madison barely looked up, her fingers still tapping at the keyboard. "Those are standard account maintenance fees, ma'am," she replied flatly. Evelyn hesitated, holding out her receipt. "But I've had this account for years, and I've never had these charges before." Madison sighed dramatically, finally glancing at her with clear annoyance. She snatched the envelope from Evelyn's hands, flipped through the papers half-heartedly, then shoved them back toward her. "It's in the fine print of your agreement," she said dismissively. "If you didn't read it, that's not our fault." Evelyn blinked, taken aback. Madison rolled her eyes loudly enough that a few people in line chuckled. Evelyn felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Look," Madison continued, her tone exaggerated and condescending. "If you don't want to pay the fees, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how banks work, ma'am." The humiliation had begun. Evelyn's throat tightened. She wasn't here to argue, she just wanted fairness. She had been a loyal customer for decades, but as she looked around, she realized that no one in the room was willing to meet her eyes. The same customers who had been loudly complaining about their own long wait times were now suddenly indifferent to her struggle. "I just want to understand what happened," she said softly, still clinging to hope. At that moment, Richard Calloway, the branch manager, walked over. He had been watching the exchange from a distance, arms crossed, deciding whether the situation was worth his time. Richard was a man who believed time was money, and in his mind, Evelyn Harris wasn't worth much of either. Clearing his throat, he looked down at her with a thin, polite smile. "Is there a problem here?" Richard asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't expecting an answer. Madison immediately straightened her posture. "No, sir," she said quickly, as if reporting to a superior officer. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies." Richard turned to Evelyn, his polite smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Ma'am, we have standard fees in place," he said smoothly. "If you can't maintain the minimum balance, there's nothing we can do." Evelyn squared her shoulders, gathering every ounce of dignity she had left. "I've always kept my account in good standing," she said firmly. "These fees just started appearing. I'm simply asking for someone to review them." Richard let out a short, amused chuckle. "What's in the system is in the system, ma'am," he said dismissively. "We don't review automated charges." Then, he delivered the final blow. Leaning slightly over the counter, he lowered his voice just enough for the entire bank to hear. "If you can't afford the fees," he said coldly, "maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." A sharp silence filled the room. Evelyn swallowed the lump forming in her throat, her fingers tightened around the envelope. She had never felt so small. Then a deep, steady voice cut through the tension. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The entire bank fell silent. Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap stood there. At first glance, he looked like any ordinary customer. But there was something about him, his posture, his voice, his presence, that made people straighten up. Richard turned slowly, irritation flashing across his face. "And who are you to question how we handle our customers?" he demanded. The man took a few steps forward, then reached up and pulled off his cap. A stunned silence filled the bank. The man standing in the middle of the room was no ordinary customer. He had a quiet but commanding presence, the kind that made people instinctively pay attention. The second Jason Cole removed his cap, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Yes, Jason Cole, the Hollywood action star, known for playing fearless, no-nonsense heroes. And now, he was standing face-to-face with Richard Calloway, the branch manager, whose once confident stance had begun to falter. "Mr. Cole." Richard stammered. Jason raised a hand slightly, cutting him off. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "It doesn't matter who I am," Jason said evenly. "What matters is why you're treating this woman like this." Evelyn Harris turned to look at Jason, her eyes wide with disbelief. She wasn't used to people standing up for her, especially not someone like him. Richard cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. "Sir, this is none of your concern. We have policies in place, and this lady does not meet the requirements." Jason tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he asked, "Policies? Or just an excuse to humiliate someone who's asking for fairness?" A few customers murmured in agreement. Madison Brooks, who had seemed so confident moments ago, now looked uncertain. She shot a nervous glance at Richard, silently waiting for him to fix the mess before it got worse. Jason turned back to Evelyn, his voice softer now. "Ma'am, what exactly is the issue? Can you show me?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment before handing him the envelope with her documents. Jason took it carefully, flipping through the papers. His expression remained unreadable, but after a few seconds, he looked up at Richard. "This is a mistake," Jason said plainly. "These charges shouldn't be here. You're going to fix it?" Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Jason raised a hand again, stopping him in his tracks. "If it's a mistake," Jason continued, his voice steady, "you'll fix it." Then his tone dropped slightly, more controlled, more dangerous. "And if it's not, then it's going to be a much bigger problem for you." Richard's face paled. Madison fidgeted, looking increasingly uncomfortable. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at Madison as if silently asking for an escape route, but she had no answers. Jason crossed his arms and stood firm, waiting. And for the first time that day, Richard Calloway looked truly nervous. Richard had spent years perfecting the art of dismissing customers like Evelyn Harris, people who, in his mind, were too old or too insignificant to challenge him. But now, the weight of the entire room was on him. Customers who had previously ignored Evelyn's struggle were now alert, their eyes darting between the Hollywood star and the man in the stiff suit. Jason's voice was steady and controlled. "This isn't about policies. It's about respect." He turned to Evelyn, his expression softening. "Ma'am, you said these fees weren't here before?" Evelyn nodded slowly, still in disbelief. "I've had this account for over 30 years. These charges just appeared 2 months ago." Jason turned his attention back to Richard, raising an eyebrow. 2 months ago? So tell me, why did her maintenance fees suddenly triple?" His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, making Richard's throat tighten. Richard forced a small chuckle, trying to regain control. "Mr. Cole, I don't think you understand how banking works. Fees are adjusted based on policies set at the corporate level. If she doesn't meet the requirements for a premium account, she incurs charges. That's how it works." Jason nodded slowly, as if considering the explanation. "Right. But tell me, Richard, do you actually review those charges? Do you check if they're correct? Or do you just assume the system is always right?" Richard hesitated. He knew he was walking into a trap, but there was no easy way out. "The system is designed to be accurate," he said cautiously. Jason exhaled sharply, an almost amused sound escaping him. "So you don't check?" He glanced down at the papers Evelyn had given him, flipping through them quickly. "Here's what I see, Richard," Jason said, holding up the documents. "A woman who's banked here for decades suddenly gets hit with fees she wasn't informed about. When she asks for clarification, she's mocked and humiliated. And now you're standing here trying to tell me it's just policy?" Richard's face turned red. His fingers tapped against his forearm, a nervous habit. "We follow guidelines," he stammered. "We don't make exceptions." Jason's expression hardened. That's where you're wrong. You do make exceptions, just not for people like Evelyn. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the entire bank, making Richard feel like the walls were closing in on him. Madison cleared her throat nervously. Mr. Calloway, maybe we should just... Richard shot her a glare that made her mouth snap shut. He was losing control, and he knew it. But Jason was just getting started. He turned toward the watching crowd. How many of you have had unexpected fees show up on your accounts in the last few months? He held Evelyn's papers up like evidence in a trial. At first, there was silence. Then, slowly, a few hesitant hands went up, a middle-aged man in a work uniform, a young woman holding a baby, an elderly couple near the back. More hands followed. Richard's stomach dropped. This was bigger than just Evelyn. Jason scanned the room, nodding slowly. So it's not just her. Interesting. He turned back to Richard. You might want to think carefully about your next words. Richard swallowed hard. He was trapped. If he continued dismissing Evelyn, he would be dismissing half the customers in the room. If he admitted fault, his career could be on the line. Jason didn't give Richard time to think. Let's check something, he said, motioning toward the computer behind the counter. Since you're so sure the system is accurate, go ahead, pull up her account. Let's see those fees. Richard hesitated. Jason tilted his head. What's wrong? I thought you said everything was clear for people who pay attention. Madison Brooks hovered her fingers over the keyboard, looking between Jason and Richard. Richard shot her a look, a silent warning. But she didn't dare defy Jason. Not now. With shaky hands, she pulled up Evelyn Harris's account. The screen loaded, the numbers glowing in stark contrast against the dim bank lighting. Jason leaned in slightly, scanning the information. A slow smile crossed his face. Well, look at that. He tapped the screen lightly. The fees started 2 months ago, right after a change in bank policy, and not just to her account. He turned toward the customers. How many of you have been banking here for more than 5 years? Several hands went up. Jason's smile didn't fade. And how many of you started seeing new charges around the same time? More hands rose. The bank was completely silent, except for the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably near the back. Jason turned back to Richard, his expression unreadable. You see where I'm going with this? Richard's face was ashen. Mr. Cole, I assure you, Richard stammered, we don't target specific people. Jason held up a hand, cutting him off. You don't? His voice was calm, almost amused. That's funny because from what I'm seeing, these new fees seem to be hitting elderly customers the hardest. He glanced around the room. People who are less likely to fight back. People who might not have the energy to challenge them. Jason exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's not policy, Richard. His tone hardened. That's a scam. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. His pulse was hammering in his ears. Jason took a step forward, lowering his voice. I don't like bullies, Richard, and I really don't like people who take advantage of the ones who deserve the most respect. He gestured toward Evelyn. This woman spent her life serving her community, helping people learn, grow, and succeed. And you're telling me she doesn't deserve basic decency? Richard was sweating now. There was no talking his way out of this. The customers were watching. The employees were watching. And worst of all, someone was recording. A young man near the front of the line held up his phone, camera rolling, capturing everything. Jason followed Richard's gaze and let out a low chuckle. Yeah, that's right, he said. This is going out there. Then he leveled Richard with a firm stare. So here's what you're going to do. Jason's voice remained steady, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You're going to reverse every single one of those charges, not just for Evelyn, but for every single customer affected. Richard clenched his jaw. Jason stepped even closer. And then, he continued, folding his arms, you're going to apologize, properly. Richard's entire career flashed before his eyes. Jason let the silence stretch between them before speaking again. And if you don't, he let the words hang in the air, shaking his head slightly. Well, let's just say I'd be really interested to see how corporate reacts when they find out their branch manager made headlines for defrauding elderly customers. Richard exhaled shakily. His shoulders slumped. He turned to Madison. Fix it, he muttered. Madison wasted no time. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, reversing every charge. The tension in the bank began to shift. Nervous whispers turned into quiet approval. Jason watched as the numbers changed on the screen. He turned back to Evelyn, offering her a small nod. "That's more like it." Richard's face was pure defeat. But Jason wasn't done. "Now," he said, folding his arms, "let's hear that apology." Richard clenched his jaw. He inhaled sharply, then exhaled. He swallowed hard. "Mrs. Harris," he said through gritted teeth, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Jason raised an eyebrow. Richard sighed heavily, his pride crumbling. "I apologize," he said again, his voice slightly stronger this time, "for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable." Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you." Jason glanced around, making sure everyone had seen it. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" He smiled slightly, then turned toward the customers. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "Speak up, stand up, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't matter." For the first time that day, the room filled with something other than tension. It filled with quiet admiration. And just like that, Jason Cole put his cap back on and walked out of the bank. But the story wasn't over yet. The moment Jason stepped out of Westwood Community Bank, the atmosphere inside shifted. Customers who had once remained passive now exchanged murmurs of approval. Employees, including Madison Brooks, struggled to process what had just happened. And Richard Calloway? He stood frozen, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. Worse, the young man near the front of the line was still recording. Richard's heart pounded as he turned toward Madison. "Shut that down, now." Madison hesitated, glancing between him and the computer screen, where the reversed fees were still displayed. "Sir?" Richard clenched his jaw. But it was too late. The young man with the phone, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Already uploaded, buddy. You can't erase this." Richard's stomach sank. Just moments ago, he had been in complete control, dismissing Evelyn Harris as just another elderly woman who wouldn't fight back. Now, his name, his face, and his actions were about to be all over the internet. Evelyn stood beside the counter, watching everything unfold with a quiet but growing sense of satisfaction. For the first time since stepping into the bank that afternoon, she didn't feel small. She had spent her life teaching others to stand up for what was right. She never thought she'd need someone like Jason Cole to remind her of that lesson. The young man with the phone grinned. "Man, this is gonna blow up. People are gonna love seeing you get put in your place." Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. His hands clenched into fists as he grabbed his suit jacket and turned sharply, heading for his office. He needed damage control. And fast. But before he could disappear behind his door, Madison Brooks spoke up. Her voice was hesitant, but clear. "Sir, I think we should report this." Richard froze. Madison continued, her voice gaining strength. "We were never supposed to charge those fees in the first place. If corporate sees this?" Richard whirled around, his face turning bright red. "You think corporate is going to back some old woman over me?" He let out a bitter laugh, though the nervous edge in his voice betrayed him. "I've been running this branch for 8 years. Bell. Ding. A phone chimed. Then another. And another. The bank filled with the sound of notifications as customers checked their screens. Evelyn looked at the young man still holding his phone. He smirked. "Told you," he said. "The video's already spreading." Richard snatched his own phone from his pocket and nearly dropped it when he saw the screen. The video was live. Hundreds of shares already. Comments flooding in. His name, his bank, his behavior, all captured in perfect clarity. And now, it was out in the world. One word escaped his lips. No. The shift in the room was undeniable. Moments ago, Evelyn had been the one looking down, ashamed. Now it was Richard. Customers no longer whispered. Some muttered in agreement. Others chuckled under their breath. A few outright shook their heads at Richard in disgust. He could feel it. The power dynamic had flipped. Then, the phone rang. Madison glanced at the caller ID. Her eyes widened. "It's corporate." Richard's stomach twisted. He snatched the phone from her hand, straightened his posture, and cleared his throat before pressing the device to his ear. "Yes, this is Richard Calloway." The voice on the other end was curt and cold. "Mr. Calloway," the voice said, "we need to talk. Now." Richard's face drained of color. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. The bank settled into an odd silence. The tension was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the quiet after a storm, the moment when the damage is being assessed. Evelyn exhaled deeply, suddenly aware of how tired she felt. It was over. She glanced around at the other customers. Many still had their phones out. Some were still whispering about what had just happened. Madison turned toward her. Her posture was less rigid now. "Mrs. Harris, I just want to say I'm sorry," she said softly. Evelyn studied her, then nodded. "I appreciate that." Madison hesitated before adding, "And I'm really sorry you had to fight for something that should have been yours in the first place." That, Evelyn knew, was the real apology. The doors to the bank opened. For a brief moment, a hush fell over the room. Everyone instinctively turned toward the entrance, almost as if expecting Jason Cole to walk back in and finish what he started. But it was just another customer, a woman with 2 children, looking as exhausted as any working mother on a Friday afternoon. Evelyn smiled to herself. Jason Cole didn't need to come back. He had already done what he came to do. A few days later, the full impact of that afternoon at Westwood Community Bank hit like an earthquake. The video of the confrontation spread faster than anyone had anticipated. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded, and within 24 hours, the bank's headquarters released an official statement. They announced an internal review of the branch's practices. By the end of the week, Richard Calloway was removed from his position. Corporate cited a failure to uphold company values and an unacceptable number of customer complaints that had suddenly gained traction in the wake of the viral video. Madison Brooks was placed under review, but ultimately kept her job after admitting that she had been pressured into following unethical instructions. Most importantly, every single customer affected by the unnecessary fees was refunded in full. Evelyn Harris watched it all unfold from the comfort of her home. She had never imagined a simple trip to the bank would turn into something this big. But as she sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reading the latest headlines about Richard's dismissal, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. Then one morning, an envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't from the bank. The return address was from a film studio in Los Angeles. Evelyn's eyebrows lifted in surprise as she carefully opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Mrs. Harris, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile." Jason Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Tucked inside the envelope was a signed movie poster and a personal invitation to one of Jason Cole's upcoming premieres. She let out a laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. She set the note down gently, running her fingers over the signature. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt valued. She felt unstoppable. Evelyn stood up, stretched, and walked toward her front door, feeling lighter than she had in years. The world wasn't perfect, but now she knew. When you fight for what's right, sometimes the right people show up to fight with you.